Welcome to this module on growing turfgrass in the shade, or at least attempting to grow turfgrass in the shade. Hopefully by the end of this module you'll understand a little bit more why we say it's very, very difficult, if not downright impossible, to grow turf grasses in the shade, especially in our part of the world. And will help you maybe formulate some of the questions that you'd want to ask homeowners, because these are some of the biggest mistakes that we find them making from a cultural standpoint with our turf grasses. So when it comes to the amount of sunlight that turf grasses require to grow optimally and do very well, not just get by but thrive, the amount that they require varies by species, and it varies by cultivar within each of the different species of turf grasses. And some things that we also have to consider is that the amount of shade or sunlight in a lawn is going to vary over time, not just on a daily standpoint from the morning to the midday to late afternoon, evening, and whatnot, but also seasonally. Different times of the year, we're going to have more sunlight on one part of the landscape compared to another, and over time, the landscape will tend to mature. And in an area where we might have had full sun, a few years later we might be in full shade, depending on the particular plants that are growing in that area, or whether we erect some sort of structure or something too. So sunlight varies within a yard during the day, it varies within the year, and it varies over a series of years as well, and that's something for us to keep in mind. We know that grasses that don't get enough sunlight will grow very long, thin, spindly blades and stems, and that causes them to work very hard to try to obtain sunlight. That elongation over time will deplete the plant's carbohydrate reserves, and that causes it to lose vigor over time, and we'll start to see it stressing more and being more susceptible to disease, insects, and even weeds to some extent. Here's a very good representation of some research plots. Up in the top left-hand corner, you see 0% shade on a turf grass, very thick, healthy, almost carpet-like. Move over to 70% just morning shade. You can see in this same particular location where we do see some reduction in the percentage of turf grass coverage compared to 80%, even 10% more. It gets a little less vigorous and is thinning compared to 90% just morning shade. And that's not even full day, the best, highest quality sunlight of the day, but just the loss of that morning sun then contributes to a tremendous loss of turf grass coverage over time. Plants absolutely need light. All of you recognize that. They need a particular hour requirement each day of sunlight, and those hours need to have a percentage of full sun associated with them as well. And so what do we mean by full sun? I mean the hot middle of the day, most intense period of sunlight, not like the first early morning sun that's coming in at an angle, not late evening sun that's coming in at an angle, but what's almost directly right over top of us, the most intense sunlight is what they need. This will drive photosynthesis that also drives the carbon cycle in our plants, our turf grasses, which is real basically the way that they produce glucose or sugars, carbohydrates, and keep themselves alive. They get to produce their own food, which is very important. If you are limiting their access to sunlight, which drives photosynthesis, you're in effect starving them very slowly over time. So our Florida turf grasses have some very particular light requirements. All of them pretty much at the very least, the low end of what they can tolerate is 6 hours of full direct sunlight in the middle of the day. And that full direct sunlight, what I mean by that is it's not filtered, and it's in the very middle of the day. Now, St. Augustine grass is sometimes said to be tolerant of shade. I would not say that or resistant. It is not shade resistant. None of the cultivars are. Some are more tolerant of a little bit less sunlight than others. And even some filtered light, now I don't mean full shade, but filtered light, about 30% filtered light, will actually reduce some of the heat and drought stress on it in the heat of the year. and you'll end up with a little bit darker green color, but that's really starting to push the limitations there of what it can tolerate. St. Augustine grass, at the absolute minimum, 6 hours of full sunlight a day. There are a few cultivars like palmetto that can push down around 4.5 to 5 hours of sunlight in the middle of the day and still get by. Many of those are sold as being resistant to shade. They are not. They're just slightly more tolerant of shade, but something we definitely want to avoid. Here's a really good representation of the types of plants that you might see in either full sun, part shade, all the way to dense shade. And if you notice here, the full shade and dense shade big trees, medium to large size trees, offer really no kind of high quality sunlight that's going to penetrate through the canopy to hit the ground, and you're not going to have turf grass growing whatsoever in full shade, dense shade, even part shade. Where it's dappled is going to be iffy for some of our turf grasses. So we're aiming full sun, direct sunlight on the plant all day long to maybe 2 or 3 hours of the day where it's filtered without direct sun. This is going to be what's optimal for our turf grasses. Anything less than that, they're going to struggle. Here are a couple of really good examples. The very top picture up here, really pretty landscape. You can see just a little bit of dappled shade in the front part of this yard. And that's going to move around throughout the heat of the day and as the sun is moving around, and would be acceptable because the great majority of that lawn is going to be getting at least 6 hours of full sun. But you can see what we mean by dappled or filtered. Compared to the bottom right, that picture, that's completely full shade, and you're not going to have turf grass there. What you actually see here is mondo grass, which is a really good alternative to turf grasses in these types of heavy shade areas. Another good really representation of turf grasses in full sun and how many hours that they absolutely have to have. Bermuda grass, 8 to 10 hours, full sun all day long, middle of the day, hottest part of the day. Anything less, Bermuda grass is going to suffer. Bahia grass, 6 to 8 hours. 8 hours, absolutely best. Zoysia grass and Floritam pushing down around 6 hours of full sun. And again, a handful of cultivars, especially some of the dwarf cultivars of St. Augustine that can handle about 5, but that's really the absolute minimum. And even then, it's not ideal for these turf grasses. So here again, we see St. Augustine grass, really the most shade tolerant of all of our turf grasses, but not good at the same time. People really tend to try to push this, and you just can't. Floritam, being our most popular cultivar of St. Augustine grass, really has poor shade tolerance, requiring at least 6 hours, and it's not happy at 6 hours of full sun, all the way over to 8 hours being optimal. Zoysia grass, Empire, the most popular, 6 to 8 hours minimum. Bahia, 7, 8 hours absolutely necessary. Bermuda grass, it just will not tolerate any level of shade at all. This is evidenced by the fact that as soon as the light levels start to drop in early fall, our Bermuda grass goes dormant, stays dormant until spring green up, usually in April. So when it comes to management practices trying to deal with shade, we know that our turf grasses will suffer from a lack of sunlight, and that our trees are usually one of the biggest competitors for light, water, nutrients, even oxygen. And so what do we do when we want our turf grasses and we also want shade? You're pretty much left up with a decision. Either make a one-cut prune where you take down your trees. Sometimes that's just not feasible, not what we want, or not what we're allowed to do if we find ourselves in an HOA setting, perhaps. And in some cases, we also have structures that interfere with light, and sometimes it's not very easy to move those as well, or not feasible. So we're looking at shade-tolerant plants, shade-loving plants in those cases, and there's some really beautiful ones that are out there. But in the case of trees, there are a few cases where we might be able to do some structural selective pruning and thinning of the canopy in a very smart way, utilizing an arborist so that we can get just a little bit more sunlight down to the turf grass. That might actually help. Just even the removal of one or two large branches might help get more sunlight down to the ground. But really, in most cases, it comes back to using shade-loving plants, even going in with just mulch in an area and trying to make it a pretty focal point. When we find turf grass in any amount of shade at all, though, there are a few cultural things we want to do to alleviate stress on it. Number one, try to increase the mowing height up to definitely those optimal levels like St. Augustine grass of 3.5 to 4 inches on the mowing height. But the higher we're mowing it, the more leaf area there is on the plant, so the more light that it's able to absorb, the more food that it can make. So that alleviates stress somewhat. It doesn't fix the problem, but it can help with stress. And that's also going to promote a much deeper rooted plant. So that's the key to stress management, is getting those roots as deep as we can to promote good anchorage, and we're promoting good contact with nutrients and water at the same time. Fertilizer, when we have turf grass in any amount of shade at all, reduce the applications of fertilizer. It's going to be growing much less slowly than it normally would in full sunlight, so reduce the amount of fertilizer applications. Grass is growing more slowly, needs less nutrients, and we also know that if we're providing too much nitrogen, that depletes the carbohydrates and weakens the turf, because when we put that nitrogen on, we're telling it to grow. And when it's growing in an area that it's not optimally living in because of reduced shade, it's going to basically be starving itself over time, and it's going to become weak and susceptible to disease, to pests, variety of insects depending on the cultivar and the species, and also weeds. So we want to be utilizing slow release nitrogen sources to minimize growth, keep it healthy and happy but slow growth. Use equal amounts of nitrogen to potassium. We know that this helps with root growth for a good strong root system. And we also are starting to see some evidence that that potassium, when it's equal to nitrogen, can help the grass sustain itself just a little bit better in partial shade. So it helps with those stress reactions, and definitely avoid traffic. Turf in shadier areas definitely is more easily injured, even when we're just walking across it. And it's certainly going to recover more slowly from any kind of wear and tear. So really stay off of any kind of shaded turf grasses. Irrigation, I think it makes sense to consider we're probably going to be needing to apply less irrigation on grass that's not in full sun. And sometimes that may mean that we even have to remove sprinkler heads in areas of an irrigation zone where we're getting very little sunlight compared to areas on that same zone that are in full sun. We also know that watering turf grass in a shady area increases disease incidences. This is a perfect climate for the pathogens. We have higher soil moisture, increased humidity, reduced air circulation generally in that kind of shady environment, so the disease pressure tends to go way up. And you also want to be scouting and monitoring any shaded turfgrass areas for disease at the same time. Weeds, stress turf just simply will not compete with weeds for space. And if you have any amount of bare ground, you're going to get weeds, even if it's in a shady spot, because you killed out your turf grass because of low levels of light. And it's really important then that we understand how to do treatments, pre and post emergence treatments with herbicides. So in conclusion, it is possible to grow some of our popular turf grasses and some of those cultivars of them in lower light areas. 7-8 hours is usually optimum for most of our turf grasses, but 5-6, depending on the cultivar, is possible. St. Augustine grass is going to be the best bet in these kinds of situations, and can tolerate a little bit of filtered light, not full shade, but a little bit of filtered light. And especially Floritam, keep in mind, is not very tolerant at all. It needs at least 6 hours of sunlight. And again, that's not optimal. It's just getting by at that point. 8 hours is much more close to where we want to be pushing. Dwarf St. Augustine grass cultivars are potential options where we have maybe 5 hours of full sunlight, but we also want to consider the use of ground covers, of mulch, shade-loving plants, reducing irrigation and fertilization so that we can try to optimize plant health. Anything we can do to make it happier, especially when it's found itself stressed. This is not the right plant in the right place scenario. So anything we can do to optimize the plant health and reduce stress will give us a better chance at having a decent coverage of turf grass in these areas. I hope you've enjoyed this particular module. If you've got any kind of questions, make sure you go back through the module or email us or give us a call.